Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. You know, censorship can be a funny thing. Not like ha-ha funny, but odd. Take, for example, the 1973 film, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Rolling Stones. The film itself was mainly a promotional concert film with footage from two shows that the Rolling Stones were playing on their 1972 North America tour, promoting their, at the time, new album called Exile on Main Street. But more diligent fans of the Stones, or perhaps music history in general, may be aware that this PG-rated venture is merely a last-minute replacement for another film that the powers that be had hoped would never see the light of day. The Rolling Stones' original 1972 North American tour film was a little gem by the name of Cocksucker Blues. The film, having never been officially released, was helmed by director and famous photographer Robert Frank. Frank's most famous work was, in fact, the 1958 photographic book, The Americans. The Guardian would go on to say that it, quote, changed the nature of photography, what it could say, and how it could say it, end quote. Adding, quote, it remains perhaps the most influential photography book of the 20th century, end quote. So the dude had some credentials, to say the least. Frank had the truly inspired idea to have several film cameras on hand and encouraged anyone in the Rolling Stones entourage to just pick up and start filming, of which they did. The end result was a true insider's peek behind the scenes of the backstage shenanigans of one of rock and roll's most notorious bands. A notoriety that, by the way, was well earned and at its peak at the time. This was the Rolling Stones' first tour back in the US since the infamous Altamont Free Concert of 1969. The show was supposed to be the Woodstock of the West, but the violence that unfolded is what cemented its place in rock and roll history. Most notable of which, but certainly not the only example, is the stabbing death of one Meredith Hunter by the motorcycle gang Hells Angels, which had been hired as security for the event. And some even claim been paid in bottles of beer. Now, there are many different points of view of how it all unfolded and why and who is to blame. For instance, I do think it should be noted that Hunter did pull a gun, but for our purposes, it may not have been the best look for the Stones at the time. Enter Cocksucker Blues. Nudity, sex, group sex, drugs, a groupie shooting heroin, and all manner of debauchery from the self-proclaimed bad boys of rock and roll and their entourage. The film was scandalous and shocking. Everything that Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones isn't. So much so that the film was shelved. But was it the censors that got to it? No. The film never made it to the rating stage. Was it perhaps the studio? No, the Rolling Stones themselves had commissioned the film. Maybe it was the record company. I mean, we all love to blame a greedy record company. But no, it was not them either. When all is said and done, it was the Rolling Stones themselves who shelved it, even going so far as to get a court order which forbade it from being shown unless the director, Robert Frank, was physically present, which they were able to do because, as mentioned before, they paid for the damn thing. For their part, the Rolling Stones feared the film would be embarrassing or even incriminating in a legal sense. Mick Jagger reportedly told Frank, quote, "It's a fucking good film, Robert, but if it shows in America, will never be allowed in the country again," end quote. Now, as these things often work, with time, bootlegs of the film started to circulate, and now you can even go watch it on YouTube. So, fortunately, Cocksucker Blues wasn't lost to the annals of time. But, and I know at this point this may seem surprising, but this isn't an episode about the Rolling Stones, Robert Frank, or Cocksucker Blues. But I hearken you back to my original statement. Censorship can be a funny thing. This week, we will be talking about the 1967 documentary film Titicut Follies, a film that garnered the distinction of being the first known instance of a film being banned from general American distribution for reasons other than obscenity, immorality, or national security. But before we dive in, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, let's take a look at this week's trigger warning. Titicut Follies is a documentary that deals with the patient inmates of Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. We will be discussing how these patients were treated, which, make no mistake, was poorly and abusive. Also, we will be discussing suicide. The film, the first from now veteran and influential documentarian Frederick Wiseman, is about a, quote, hospital for the criminally insane, end quote, what we might now more humanely call a forensic hospital. The film gains its title from a talent show that is put on by the hospital staff, featuring mostly the patients/prisoners, but also some special appearances by the staff. Though the show and preparation for the show is often going on in the background of the film's main focus is on the patients and how they are treated by the staff at the hospital. Shot on grainy black and white film stock with sound solely from a microphone held by Wiseman off screen, from the very beginning, you as an audience member feel the drabness of the gray brick walls and the subdued chaos of the reverberant chatter of its inhabitants. The film is shot in a style known as direct cinema. You may be familiar with direct cinema's creative cousin, as it were, cinema verite, both of which were particularly popular forms of shooting documentaries in the 1950s and 60s. Both were conceived as attempts of finding truth through film. In fact, cinema verite is French for truthful cinema. Both spurred on by the invention of newer, smaller, lightweight, and most importantly, handheld cameras, allowing for the first time the ability to just pick up and film. Just as important, if not more so, was the advent of portable audio recorders that were capable of capturing live synchronous sound. All of a sudden, the work that would require a whole sound stage and a gigantic crew can be done by two people. Now, obviously, it would not look the same, but it was now possible, allowing, especially for documentarian filmmakers, a sort of closeness and intimacy with their subject that before would have been unimaginable. The main difference between cinema verite and direct cinema, like Titicut Follies, is the involvement of the filmmaker. Cinema verite, to some extent, makes the artistic concession that no matter how small the camera and sound equipment are, their presence acts as a barrier to the truth in the film that they are searching for. What is done to counteract this effect is to throw the filmmaker into the story, as it were, allowing for a subjective truth to be uncovered in the film, whereas direct cinema is more focused on objective truth by being a fly on the wall and hoping to capture the truth. Mr. Wiseman had this to say about cinema verite, quote, "Cinema verite is a French bullshit term," end quote. And Titicut Follies very much falls under direct cinema. No interview, no voiceover, mostly no score, just the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane and its inhabitants. Through the course of the film, we see numerous acts of needless aggressions or sometimes brutal indifference played out by those in charge on the people who, at least on paper, they are there to care for. Some of the many inhumanities that we see played out on screen include inmates being routinely stripped naked and in many cases left that way, being locked away in empty rooms, sometimes with nothing more than a bucket. One inmate, who clearly had a not very subtle mental delay, was admonished repeatedly while being stripped fully nude for having a messy room, only for us, the audience, to find out when they returned him to his, I call it a room because there are walls, not bars, but he and the others are locked in there. Make no mistake, it's a cell. Regardless, when they return him to his cell, we see that he has literally nothing in there, making it impossible for him to have had a dirty room. In another scene, the camera captures two guards talking about how one of the patients was gassed on that guard's day off. But now, after the guard returned days later, the lingering gas makes him uncomfortable and his eyes itch. We also meet Vladimir, a patient seemingly of sound enough mind, who spends the entire film begging to go back to regular jail because while he admits he has mental problems, he is also aware enough to admit that they are only being made worse while being there. And in one of the most gut-wrenching scenes, an older gentleman is strapped to a table and force-fed via a tube that has jammed down his nose into his stomach with a funnel at the end. It should be noted that they were out of the proper lubricant, so motherfucker goes full Last Tango in Paris and uses the butter. His quote-unquote doctor pours what looks like mush or soup into the funnel. The old man, clearly in distress, while the doctor continues to chat away with the guards, never having even stopped smoking his cigarette to do the procedure or maneuver or whatever you want to call it. What makes all of this even more jarring is intercut with the footage of the old man being force-fed is footage of his body being prepared for burial by the mortician. Two brutal realities hit you in the face at once. Not only do you know this man who you are watching suffer will soon no longer be amongst the living, but also that he was treated with more care and dignity in death than he was in life. It is one of the more infamous scenes of the movie that director Fred Wiseman now says he thinks is heavy-handed and is kind of embarrassed of. Be that as it may, heavy-handed or not, the scene is truly chilling. Now, in the interest of transparency, obviously not everyone there was an angel. The film even starts off with an inmate being interviewed by his doctor, who admits to having molested young children, including his own daughter. But even with that being said, the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane has a long history of mistreatment of those who pass through its gates. In 1968, a series of hearings were conducted after a study showed that 30, count them 30, of its inhabitants were committed illegally. One prisoner, known only as Charles, was even admitted to Bridgewater in 1910 for breaking and entering, a crime that had a maximum sentence of 2 years. He was still being held there in 1967. That's 57 years later. Also, in 1967, a legislative committee investigated them for, quote, cruel, inhuman, and barbarous treatment, end quote, and the list goes on and on and on and on. In fact, as recently as 2014, a civil lawsuit was settled out of court regarding a patient's declining health from abuse, namely being excessively restrained and secluded. The particular patient had spent over 6,000 hours in isolation, despite never having been convicted of any crime. Fun fact, Albert DeSalvo, more infamously known as the Boston Strangler, spent a small stay there before escaping. He would eventually turn himself back in via his lawyer and be moved to a maximum security prison. Sadly, it should be noted that cases like Bridgewater are far too frequent in America, and indeed throughout the world. The shameful truth is that we as a species have a thoroughly long and destructive track record when it comes to dealing with our fellow humans with mental issues, making things like Bridgewater closer to a rule than an exception, even with monumental works like the novel/play/film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, shining a light on such institutions and how, in general, we treat folks with mental illness. We still have an outstandingly long way to go. Titica's Follies could have been an opportunity to jumpstart that process, exposing people to the harsh reality that up until that point had been so easy to lock away, both out of sight and out of mind. There was one problem, though. In 1968, after only having had one screening in New York, the Massachusetts Superior Court Judge Harry Callis ordered the film to be recalled from distribution and all copies destroyed. Now, it's undeniable that the film certainly had content that many would find objectionable. I mean, we've been through the list of just some of the acts contained in the film, and it's pretty disturbing, especially in a documentary context where we know these things were actually happening. All of that being said, it was the year 1967 and cinema was coming of age. For decades, the content of film had been subject to the Motion Picture Production Code, better known as the Hays Code. The Hays Code was basically a set of rules and industry guidelines created by the major studios to self-censor their films. While it was a set of restrictions Hollywood placed upon itself, the ramifications would be felt across all of cinema as adherence to the code was tied to distribution. The major Hollywood studios had an iron grip on the theaters of America, and hence did declare that for a film to be shown in the theater, it needed to have a certificate of approval. Also, one more thing to note. At the time, this wasn't just a big deal. It was the only deal, as there was no home market for films to go direct to. The end result being the film stayed mighty tame through this era. But that all started to crumble starting in 1948. The first blow was the Supreme Court ruled that movie studios owning or otherwise controlling movie theaters was in fact a violation of antitrust laws. With the studios out of the theater business, one of the things that theaters started to do was import foreign movies that weren't bound by the rules of the Hays Code, and Americans loved it. Also, in 1952, the Supreme Court was at it again when they unanimously ruled that films were in fact a form of art and thus were protected under the First Amendment. This was in fact a reversal of the decision the court made all the way back in 1915 that said that movies were not an art form but merely a business and should be regarded as such. Quick side note. If you are one of the folks that says video games aren't an art form, that's how you sound right now. But back to Titica's Follies. Add to that the fact that during this time, television was becoming a household staple. Hollywood had some true competition for the first time. The result was the code's enforcement was made weaker and weaker in an attempt to keep up with foreign films and new technologies like television. And though the Hays Code would see its official end in 1968, many folks consider the film Bonnie and Clyde from 1967 to have finally done the Hays Code in. Not only was it outstandingly violent and made obvious references to sex that was dun 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 out of wedlock and showed bank robbers and murderers in a sympathetic light, but it was also beautiful and powerful. So then why, oh why, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, was this film, The Titicut Follies, banned by a court of the United States of America when these artificial boundaries of cinema were being demolished left and right? In an era where film was going farther than it ever had before, Well, the technical answer is, according to good old Judge Harry Callis, the film violated the patient's privacy and dignity. Now, on the surface, this isn't inherently a bad thing or unjust. I mean, I did just spend a not insignificant portion of the beginning of this podcast episode talking about how the United States, and in fact the world, could and should send more kindness and dignity towards those whose mental health is waning. Although I feel it must necessarily be noted that the clear intent of having the film destroyed was that it reflected very poorly not only on the Bridgewater State Hospital, but the Massachusetts Department of Corrections as a whole. An institution that, by the way, until this very day has one of the highest suicide rates amongst the people that it has locked up in the entire nation. So much so that a 2020 report from the U.S. Department of Justice concluded there is, quote, reasonable cause to believe that the MDOC has engaged in a pattern or practice of resistance to rights protected by the Eighth Amendment because it fails to provide constitutionally adequate supervision and mental health care to prisoners in mental health crisis and place them in mental health watch for prolonged periods of time under restrictive housing conditions that violate their constitutional rights. End quote. And just as a reminder, the Eighth Amendment, that's the one banning cruel and unusual punishment. Now, I will take just a small moment to note that we do have an entire documentary that damns the state of Massachusetts and not much documentation in terms of their defense. And I do hate to be cynical, but after seeing and knowing what these prisoners went through, it becomes difficult to make the leap that violating their privacy was where the state of Massachusetts drew the line. Massachusetts argued that Wiseman had not obtained release forms from the patients, despite the fact he had received permission from everyone in the film to be in the film, or received permission from the hospital superintendent, who was the legal guardian of the patients. Massachusetts also argued that Wiseman had broken an oral contract that would give the state final say in the edit of the film, which essentially boils down to a they said argument. Now, luckily, Wiseman was able to stop the destruction of the film by appealing the case from the Massachusetts Superior Court to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which not only has more power, but also comes with tomatoes and sour cream. The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled the film and all of its copies didn't have to be destroyed. But, and this is a big but, it could only be shown to doctors, lawyers, judges, healthcare professionals, social workers, and students in these and related fields. The film still being out of the eye of the general public, Wiseman appealed once again, this time to the United States Supreme Court. Sadly, the case was refused. In a dissent joined by Justice William J. Brennan Jr., Justice John Marshall Harlan II stated, quote, a further consideration is that fact that these inmates are not only the wards of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but are the charges of society as a whole. It is important that conditions in public institutions should not be cloaked in secrecy, lest citizens may disclaim responsibility for the treatment that their representative government affords those in its care. At the same time, it must be recognized that the individual's concern with privacy is key to the dignity, which is the promise of civilized society. End quote. That left Titicut Follies in the dark with the exception of a very chosen few. That would start to change 20 years later. In a seemingly unrelated case in 1987, the New York Times had done an expose on Bridgewater after it had a startling 8 patients die in a single year. The families of 7 of those inmates joined together to sue the hospital itself and the state. One of the patients in particular was restrained for 2.5 months and given 6 psychedelic drugs at vastly unsafe levels, and ended up choking to death because he could not swallow his food. It was his attorney, Stephen Schwartz, who brought up the fact that, quote, there is a direct connection between the decision not to show that film publicly and my client dying 20 years later, and a whole host of other people dying in between, end quote. It would be only a few years later in 1991 that Wiseman would bring the case back to the Massachusetts Superior Court. It was there that Justice Gil Meyer declared that, quote, I have seen no evidence of any harm to any individual as a result of the film being exhibited on a limited basis, end quote. And as each year passes, the privacy issue of the case is of less concern to the court than the First Amendment issue. I am now convinced that the scales have tipped in favor of an unrestricted showing, end quote. And like that, after 24 years of darkness, all restrictions on showing Titicut Follies were lifted and the film could come out in the light of the general public for the first time. There was one small caveat, though. The state Supreme Court of Massachusetts ordered that, quote, a brief explanation shall be included in the film that changes and improvements have taken place at Massachusetts Correctional Institution Bridgewater since 1966, end quote. And in what I will call a post-credit scene that puts anything the MCU has ever done to shame. After the very sparse credits play, a card comes up that reads, and I quote, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts has ordered that, quote, a brief explanation shall be included in the film that changes and improvements have taken place at Massachusetts Correctional Institution Bridgewater since 1966, end quote. It was then directly followed by a card that simply read, quote, changes and improvements have taken place at Massachusetts Correctional Institution Bridgewater since 1966, end quote. I don't know if that move is incredibly petty or flat out genius, or both, but I do know that I absolutely love it. And unlike Cocksucker Blues, Titicut Follies can be had outside of the benevolence of bootleggers. The film aired in 1992 on PBS, and now you can buy the film on DVD through its distributor, Zipporah Films. And it even aired on Turner Classic Movies in 2020. Also, if you are so inclined, you can watch it for free on a great streaming service called Canopy. That is, if it is affiliated with your local library and you have a library card through said library. And even though we now have complete ability to watch this film, when you watch it, and for what it's worth, I think you should. It can be devastating and ugly, but I think that makes it more important to understand where our systems have come from. But when you watch it, as if you do, it becomes so hard not to wonder, especially now after most, if not all, of the inmates in the film are long deceased, how much more impact could this film have had in 67 rather than 91? I'm not so naive as to think it would have caused us to have solved the whole mental health issue overnight. But still, how many could have been saved? A question especially worth pondering in light of the fact that the real effort to protect was made to protect the already dingy reputation of the Massachusetts Departments of Correction in the state of Massachusetts. Now, before I sign off, I wanted to send a huge shout out and thank you to our newest contributor, Jessica Hobbs, who is amazing and who did just so much research for this episode. Do yourself a favor and check her out at jessicahobbswrites.com. The link will be in the show notes. Final fun fact, I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.